So that's the Darren Walker that I know. Now, Darren, I think you need a standing ovation for that one, but we'll hold that. Now, I know, Darren, that your purpose there was to honor the Ballet Hispanico, but what was the other impact? How did it kind of recast the Ford Foundation in others' eyes?
Well, there was no intention to recast the Ford Foundation, really. I was first asked if I would be honored by a longstanding grantee, Ballet Hispanico, and I explained to them that I don't believe foundation presidents should receive honors, that should they wish to honor the Ford Foundation, I'd be happy to accept the award on behalf of the foundation. And it turned out that the evening that they wanted to do the event, I was visiting our office down in Santiago, and they asked me to make a taped message. And we've all been to those galas and hear those dreadful taped messages with the talking head when the lights go down and completely ruins the buzz of the event. And so I told my communications director, no, I'm not going to do that. Just have one of the vice presidents accept the award. And they came back and said, no, they want a message from you. And so a very smart young member of our communications staff said, I think I have a way to convince him to do it.
But for many, I mean, the Ford Foundation has been seen as a bit remote, a bit stuffy. So it seems to me that part of your role as CEO is to, not establish the culture, but draw out the culture, the true culture of the foundation. As you think about this foundation, what is the lens that we should see it through? Should it be a social justice lens? Is there a different lens?
Well, I think the role of any CEO is to translate, transmit, to imbue the values of the institution he or she represents. So that's my job. And I think the conversation that I had with my trustees during the search process would have led them to believe they were choosing someone who had a particular point of view about philanthropy and about the way philanthropy needs to be represented. I think you're right. Regrettably, my institution is known to some as a place that is somewhat remote. I'm not a remote person. I'm pretty accessible, at least I try to be. I think Ford's history has been a remarkable legacy of great social justice work that I'm enormously proud of and feel hugely honored to have the opportunity to serve the institution. But at its core, it's a social justice philanthropy, and that is a particular kind of philanthropy.
And presumably that's the passion that you seek to kind of call out in your program officers. But was it ever thus? I mean, when you think back to the founder, to Henry Ford, were his values aligned with the foundation that exists today? And how does one go about both honoring the legacy of the founder on the one hand, but ensuring that one's program reflects the sensibilities and the pressing needs and ideals of the day?
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about our founder without talking about context. I've worked for two extraordinary institutions with great donors, John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford, and both of them were complex characters. And of course, their names today are revered, but we have to understand the context. It was a very different world. I'm often reminded that Henry Ford was known in his day as a rabid anti-Semite and a racist. I'm reminded that John D. Rockefeller in his day was so reviled that Congress would not give him a charter to give his money away, because the view of Congress was that John D. Rockefeller was such a nefarious character that there was nothing good that could come of a charity with his name on it. And so, yes, they were difficult men, and I think it's unlikely that Henry Ford would have imagined a world where a Black gay man was the president of a foundation bearing his name. But I will say that Henry Ford's grandson, Edsel's son, Henry Ford II, had a great vision for a modern Ford Foundation, which he really created. And that foundation has really been the foundation of our work today. And so I think we're very proud of that, and we're very proud of our donor. Our donor helped. Today, when we talk about inequality, Henry Ford was worried about inequality during his day, and that is why he created the idea of a middle class worker who could actually afford to buy Ford Motor Company products.
So here we are in 2014, and the global economy has created tremendous wealth, and it's also exacerbated disparities. As you think about inequality, is that the moral imperative of the day, is addressing that, and especially for you at the Ford Foundation?
Well, my personal view is that the two issues of our day are climate change and inequality. And those are the two issues that affect every part of the globe. And both are highly contested issues. I think when the IPCC report came out and Dr. Pachauri, R.K. Pachauri, the Indian climate scientist who chaired that panel, presented his report, he was roundly criticized. And a group of deniers emerged who quite successfully distracted us from paying attention to what he was saying. And 15 years later, we all know that what he said at the time was true. And we've lost over a decade being distracted from doing the things that we need to do to solve the problem. My fear is that the same thing is happening with inequality, and that those who are sounding the alarm are today being discredited by some of the same forces. And this is not to say that I understand why inequality is so divisive. As someone who was poor and someone who is today part of the 8% of the 1%, I understand why people feel, well, I've earned this money and I've earned it the right way. And so when we are presented with data or evidence that contradicts that, it's very contested. And the way it's been done, which I don't think has been helpful, one, to vilify rich people, to imply that there is a simple solution to inequality. And taxing the rich alone is not going to solve inequality. We do need to have a conversation in this country about distribution, but we also need to have a conversation about education, which is another great contributor to inequality, about technology and automation. That's contributing to inequality. And about a broken political system. That contributes to inequality. So unless we're willing to have a full conversation, we're not going to solve this challenge.
I think I've heard that the gap in the earnings capacity between those with a high school education and those with a college education doubles every 10 years in this country. If that's so, it's a powerful argument for your point of view. You've chosen two issues that require a long view. And no one institution, in fact, no one sector can probably solve them on their own. Do the solutions lie at the intersection of the public, private, and philanthropic sector? Are there roles for all, both in the climate debate or in the climate issue, but also in the issue of inequality?
It's essential. Neither problem will be solved by any one sector. So take climate change. There's some remarkable work going on, led by Hewlett and Packard, the presidents of whom are here this evening, to forge the kind of public-private response, global response, that's going to be needed. No one sector, and certainly not philanthropy, can any longer believe that we alone have the resources to solve one of the great problems of our time. We don't. We've got to figure out how to better collaborate, co-create and design, and to subordinate our egos, which sometimes distort our behavior, to ends that don't serve our moral mission.
You've been praised by Judith Rodin, for whom you used to work when you worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, for being particularly skilled at working across sectors. So I'm going to just take two examples and ask you about them. In one instance, while you were at Rockefeller, you worked on the response to Hurricane Katrina and what Hurricane Katrina revealed about New Orleans. And now in the Ford Foundation, you've collaborated with many of with the foundations, with some of the leaders of which are here, on, in response to the bankruptcy in Detroit. Tell us what those two instances called upon you to do. What was required of you as a philanthropic leader in those two instances?
Well, I think it was to recognize that we are part of a much larger theater, and we are just the chorus. And I think it is challenging for leaders of philanthropy to see themselves in that way. And it's hard for leaders generally, because leaders place themselves at the center of every narrative. And we in philanthropy are particularly skilled at doing that. And so I think that the most important quality of a leader in philanthropy today is the capacity to really subordinate, to really keep your eye on the prize of the mission, and not be concerned about whether you're going to get credit, whether the New York Times is going to quote you, whether your board is going to feel like, well, we did this and the evaluation metric is going to attribute to us that outcome. We have to be concerned about those things. But when you're trying to build collaboration, you really have to be prepared for it not to be about you.
What's striking about Detroit, and we read about it in the front pages of the newspapers every day, is that you're not just a funder in this, and the other foundations, the Knight Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Community Foundation that's engaged in this as well. You're being called upon to be coalition builders, like big city politicians. You're being called upon to raise money from others. Talk about the skill set that's required in this new age and this kind of collaboration.
I think the fundraising skill is probably what I love the most, because having run a nonprofit, I developed that skill. And I think sometimes when people come to philanthropy, they think that, thank goodness, I no longer have to raise money or ask for money. I, in fact, think that we in institutional philanthropy are probably better organized and positioned to raise money than our grantees are, because I can pick up the phone and call Alberto Evergoen at Knight or Larry Kramer at Hewlett, and they'll return my call. And often what I'm saying to them is, I need your help, and they will respond. And so I think that capacity to ask for help is something that I have found has, I think, redounded to my benefit in my institutions time and time again.
This won't be the last city, unfortunately, to declare bankruptcy. Do you find that you're developing a blueprint for the next time around?
Well, I hope there isn't another time around like what Detroit has experienced. And I don't submit that what the foundations have done in Detroit in partnership with the remarkable governor and state legislature under the real direction of this phenomenon called Judge Gerald Rosen, who has really been our field marshal. That process isn't going to be replicated, and it's not about replication. It is about what are the lessons that can be extracted from this experience for foundations in other settings. And not only for foundations, but for the broader community, because at the end of the day, what's happening in Detroit is not about the foundations. It's about the community. The fact that thousands of pensioners who are working class people, the average pension, as Alberta reminded us today, is $18,000 a year. That's plus their Social Security is what most of these pensioners lived off of. And so it's about them, and it's about the resilience of this amazing city that, in spite of malfeasance and incompetence on the part of leaders, has figured out a way to pull itself together and get on with it. And that is something that we all should be celebrating.
The social contract, or sort of an allocation of roles and responsibilities in sort of stewardship and governance, it feels like that's contested, right? That almost it's in flux. Who suffers when the social contract is contested?
I think what I regret about the discourse today in our country is that the idea of the public is contested. And so anything that is the public, whether it is public schools, public parks, public housing, public health insurance, they're just contested in the political context and in our social discourse. And I am really challenged by that idea. I am enormously grateful to have lived in a country that allowed someone from my background, in large part through a belief in the public, to dream and aspire to something that was in no way a realistic vision for myself, given who I am and what I was. And yet, in large part, because I lived in a nation that profoundly believed in me, in spite of the fact that I was a poor kid living in a little shotgun house in Ames, Texas. In spite of that, and in part because of that, a lady walked up onto our porch and told my mother about a program, a public program, called Head Start. And it was a new idea of government to help kids like me get a head start. And so my life, the entire mobility escalator I've ridden, has in part been financed by, supported by this idea of the public. And what I despair over as an American is that that idea today is a contested one.
So you were born in a charity hospital. You were in one of the early Head Start programs. You attended University of Texas on a Pell Grant. So as we look back at those kinds of programs and we assess them, what role does evidence play? Do these become kind of political footballs, or are there ways to sort of look back at these programs in a dispassionate way, see what works and what doesn't, and move forward with the successes?
I do believe that we need evidence-based policy. There is no doubt about it. And I worry that one of the downsides of the last 40 years of government policy has been to create communities who are connected to particular funding streams and populations who are connected to those funding streams who aren't always able, in the face of evidence, to come to grips with terminating a program that's not working. And I think we have to think about that. There was a time, certainly, when Head Start was under scrutiny, and there have been a lot of lessons about Head Start because not all of Head Start has worked. So it's been important to continue to improve upon that idea. But the basic fundamental premise that there should be a publicly financed program for low-income urban and rural children is one that I do believe we want. We just want to make sure whatever the program is, Head Start or any program, that it actually works.
Now, strategic philanthropy has come to mean an approach that involves logic models and linear progression from inputs to outputs to outcomes to impact, I guess is the way it goes. As you think about that linear progression, is that how social change works? Is that how it happens?
Well, I want to be clear that I think, again, we have allowed ourselves to degenerate into this binary about evaluation. And it's important to understand that no one wants a program that doesn't work or an idea that's a bad idea. But there are different ways to approach assessing the effectiveness of a particular intervention. So I worked at a foundation that had a major program on seeds and soils. It's a great development program, measuring whether a particular cassava seed works in this topography or that topography is a pretty straightforward scientific experiment. When you talk about something like a program, for example, the Ford Foundation's work over a number of years around LGBT equality, how do you measure? How do you create a log frame if you have an idea about something like marriage equality? Or we made our first grant on apartheid in 1953. And that was because the foundation had a great interest in Africa. But it was 1953, and most of the world didn't know what apartheid was. And over the ensuing 35 years, we continued a program that on any given day, an evaluator could have said, there are better ways to spend your money. There were times in that program when we were accused of supporting enemies of the state, because it's hard to believe, but there was a time when Nelson Mandela was an enemy of the state, and our own government took up that position. And yet, we at the foundation continued with this idea that that country, South Africa, could one day be liberated. And so I take solace in the fact that we didn't obsess over a logic framework for our program in South Africa, that we took the long haul and we were guided by a belief in fundamental human dignity, and that our mission demanded of us that we empower and support the leadership in South Africa and who were abroad to raise awareness to ultimately bring freedom for the majority of the population there. I don't think we would have been able to do that had we been obsessed with log frames and logic models.
This is an instance in which you took a risk, in essence, or the foundation took a risk and maintained a long view. That's what's key there. And we're often told that the philanthropic sector is unique in its ability to think long-term and to take risks. But does it, as a general matter? Or is it sometimes very risk-averse?
Well, I think Another trend in our culture more broadly is short-termism. And when I talk to corporate CEOs, it's something that they are frustrated by. The quarterly analysts report and how that is harmful and distorts their own behavior. What I am frustrated by in philanthropy is that we don't have quarterly analyst reports. We actually have the luxury of taking the long view and of taking risk. And I think we don't optimize our ability and our capacity to take risk. My own institution, I don't think, does it as well as we should, given the capacity that we have, given that the board trustees firmly believe that the foundation should be taking smart strategic risk. And so what I want to do in the coming years is figure out how to deploy all of our capital on high risk, high payoff efforts that address our mission and that get at some of the root causes of the injustice, too much injustice that we see in the world.
I think about a grant that the Ford Foundation made in the 1970s to an economist in Bangladesh named Muhammad Yunus. And I think it was a $25,000 grant, and he was setting off to do one thing, and in the midst of it, he got an idea. And the idea was microfinance. And so he called up his program officer and said, do you mind if I use that $25,000 differently? And that program officer felt free to say, no problem, go ahead. Today, if the next Muhammad Yunus walked into the Ford Foundation, would the foundation be able to recognize that opportunity and have the flexibility to just go with it?
Honestly, I think the answer is it depends. And the reason I can't say it unequivocally is because I think in order for that scenario to play itself out fully, I think we've got a lot of work to do internally on our own culture, because I don't think that everyone at the foundation feels sufficiently empowered to take that risk. And so part of my job as the new president is to give them license and to give them support and agency so that they can feel that they have the capacity to do it, and that when they fail, that they'll be rewarded for smart failure and not embarrassed or publicly humiliated because their program went up in spectacular flames. Because if it's a bold enough idea, the odds are often it will go up in flames. And that's the way it's supposed to be, because at the same time, somebody else has a bold idea and it's a spectacular success. And we as an institution have to do a better job of celebrating both.
It's interesting because Darren is here as part of the Aspen Philanthropy Group, which is CEOs of foundations throughout North America. And one of the things, we talked about accountability last night, and Larry Kramer of the Hewlett Foundation said, you know, there's reputational accountability, and that's probably the strongest force on us. We want to do a good job, and VCN is doing a good job. So I think that goes along with your sense.
We want to do a good job, but if all we do is succeed, we're not doing a good job. That's the point. The point is we want... So I am lucky enough to lead this great social justice foundation, but I know that implicit in that, by simply saying that we are a social justice foundation, that statement is a contested statement. And so my reputation and the reputation of my institution, of course, is at risk. And how people see me and it will depend on their perspective. I read someone recently, a prominent person, who mocked the idea of social justice. And I was very disheartened by it, because the idea of social justice is rooted in our religious tradition. And the gospel talks about the idea of a more just society. Martin Luther King preached about the idea of a beloved society. And the fact that the idea, the very notion of it, could be publicly mocked, and the person who says it isn't publicly rebuked, I think is an indication of how far we have to go to get our moral compass back as a nation.
Does that mean that a foundation president or an individual leader like you, even when you weren't the foundation president, does that mean that you have a responsibility to be an advocate at times?
Well, I think it means that we certainly have an obligation to have a point of view. I find it difficult to imagine today being the head of a social justice foundation and not having a point of view about the world. And so it's not that we want to be an advocate. I'm probably not a good advocate. We fund literally hundreds of terrific advocacy organizations in the United States and around the world. But I do have an obligation to represent our mission, our vision as an institution, the view of the foundation as we look out into the world and assess from the perspective of a social justice foundation what our work is. So I don't think I need to be an advocate, but I certainly need to have a point of view and use the privilege of leading a large foundation to talk about that.
One of the things, there are many people who come out of the private sector in the room. As I came in, I recognized some folks. And they, of course, are among the first to say, if I don't fail a few times, I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not reaching far enough. There's another way in which private sector actors will sometimes think that I'd be curious to know whether this is so in the world of foundations. And that is that sometimes a lot of their best decisions were based on instinct. Just that intuitive sense, that way to spot talent and spot a good idea. Do you feel that your program officers and that those you've known throughout your career, are they selected in part for that skill set? Do they have that skill set? And is that what's rewarded?
Well, I think part of, and again, I can only speak for large institutional philanthropy, which is a very small part of a hugely heterogeneous philanthropic community in this country. But certainly for large institutional foundations, I believe that many of the frontline program staff, the amazing program officers who do the real work, feel constrained and feel contained by a construct of how we see impact and how we think about rigor in a way that doesn't always allow for serendipity, that does not make room for that which is organic and emergent. And that's a problem, because it is at that intersection where real creativity happens. The idea of the program officer hired to be a project manager is very offensive to me. And I often say, if you want a project manager, get a project manager. Don't get a program officer, because a program officer should have a skill set that allows them to do exactly that, to spot talent, to help think about building, how you build an institution, to be the kind of coach and supporter and trainer of their grantees, to be a translator and transmitter in a way. And I think probably too many program officers feel they don't have the agency to do that, that they are mere actors in a value chain in a very elegant PowerPoint that starts with arrows and chevrons showing inputs and ends with a page with a big exclamation point saying impact. And what most of them know is the truth, which is that that's actually not how change happens in the real world. And it's particularly not how change happens in the lives of poor and vulnerable and marginalized people.
I want to turn back for a second. You've often talked, Darren, about the importance of putting the grantee and the grantee's goal at the center rather than the foundation at the center. Just say one more word about that, because you started to go there.
Well, I just, as a former grantee, I used to be the recipient of the PowerPoint. And what I was frustrated by sometimes was that my organization wasn't represented in a way that I had hoped it would be represented, which was that we were actually the key actor in the change that was envisaged. And in fact, the foundation was the key actor. And in some ways, I'm hyperbolizing because I don't want anyone to infer that I don't believe that we need structure and we need theory and we need discipline in our thinking. I just think that the way it is represented should place the foundation. Again, I use metaphors like theater and dance. We are not the casting director. We're not George Balanchine and putting New York City Ballet together. We are maybe at best a soloist in the company, but we're certainly not the star, prima donna ballerina, and we're certainly not, the conductor. And I think it's how to right-size that is what's needed.
I want to turn to the private sector for a minute, just because you've been so effective in working across sectors. And actually, you're a former banker and a former lawyer, so you've been in the private sector as well as the philanthropic sector. We're starting to see companies take on social issues as they look at their value chain. They want social good to be intrinsic to the value chain. We've seen reporting on Samsung's efforts to ensure that there's no forced labor in that supply chain. These are complex supply chains. It's not as easy as it sounds. Google's trying to reduce its carbon footprint. Nike working on women and girls. The private sector sees itself as a social actor as well. Are they partners of yours, or do your strategies sometimes complement each other?
So I couldn't agree more that there is enormous creativity and energy in the private sector today addressing very important social issues, from climate change to education to all sorts of things. And I think many in the progressive philanthropy community have historically not looked at the private sector as a partner, and have sometimes made assumptions about the private sector. As someone who has worked in both, I'm often surprised at the naivete of both sectors. So I have friends who, in the private sector, who say, "Oh, thank goodness, it must be so nice working for a nonprofit so you don't have to bill hours like you did at Cleary Gottlieb and work the mad hours that we bankers have to work, and aren't you lucky?" And, I have never worked harder. I've never worked harder. And I also then have heard really naive statements by colleagues at foundations about the private sector, which really reflect a naivete and just a sheer ignorance of how markets work, of how transactions are structured, of how capital flows. Just really naive things. And so I think that we have education to do. And I think people like myself and many of you in this audience, who have worked in both sectors, have a role to play to bridge. Because again, going back to where we started, the problems of our time are not going to be solved without both public and private. And we've got extraordinary leaders, people like Paul Pullman at Unilever and Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, these amazing visionaries who see themselves as leaders of responsible corporations. And we need to capitalize on that leadership and exalt them and salute them and endorse them. And hopefully in the process, others will be inspired by them.
And they can bring efficiency and scale. We need both. So I'm going to open it up for the audience, and just as a quick transition, note that that Ford was one of the early champions. You may have begun the whole notion of program-related investments, PRIs, but we're now at a point, we were discussing this amongst the participants in the Aspen Philanthropy Group, where the Heron Foundation is putting its entire endowment into investments that advance their mission, that are job creators, et cetera. So we'd love to have a conversation also about the ways in which the philanthropic sector has actually entered and used the tools of other sectors. So mics are out there, just raise your hand. I should note that tomorrow there's going to be a live web chat amongst Ashoka Fellows on this conversation with Darren. So if you ask Darren a question that would inspire that kind of chat, please do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Araceli Campos. I'm from Los Angeles, here with the Aspen Institute Fellowship for Emerging Nonprofit Leaders, sponsored by American Express and Richard Brown. Thank you. So we represent emerging leaders. We're a very diverse group from around the country, and we all work at nonprofits that are funded by the philanthropic sector, and many of us have aspirations, myself included, of joining the philanthropic world one day to make a difference from that side of the table. A lot of us know that we represent the communities we serve, like you, and yet we find the foundation world daunting to enter. And so what advice do you have for the long-term trajectory of the philanthropic sector to reflect our generation, the communities we serve, and to really engage with us as leaders on a more personal level?
Great question. And Ken Chenault and American Express should be very pleased with your introduction. So this is a really interesting question. First, how does one think about coming to a foundation and working at a foundation? I never wanted a career in philanthropy. I still don't want a career in philanthropy. What I wanted when I left Wall Street was a life dedicated to social justice work. And I never applied to work at a foundation. I was sitting at my desk up in Harlem in 2000, and someone called me and said, I gave your name to the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and you may get a call. And indeed, a few weeks later, I did get a call, and I was in his office a few weeks later, and lo and behold, I was hired at Rockefeller. And in all honesty, I must admit that I learned after a somewhat grueling set of interviews after I was hired that there were some in the process who did not think that I would be a good fit for Rockefeller. I didn't have a PhD. I hadn't attended an Ivy League school. I had never written for an academic or prestigious journal. And I just was a very not Rockefeller-ish kind of person. And so I think it's important to, one, as I said when I was at Rockefeller and then at Ford, to be clear about what is your anchor and why you are there. I actually truly don't want a career in philanthropy. I want to make a difference in the world. And a foundation is a really good place to do that for a while. And so for me, as I give advice, I think what's really important is not to be concerned with getting into a foundation to give away money but to be very clear about what your anchor and what moors you, and to want to do that wherever, when I was interviewing to be president of Ford, at one point, I had to really think about, well, what happens if the trustees don't choose me and they choose one of the other candidates? And I really did. It was so easy for me to think about myself not at a foundation and not to feel like my career would be over or that I would not have a way to make a difference, because there are lots of ways to make a difference. And I think I could have added value in lots of different places based on my experience. So I think the point you raise about, I think implicit about diversity, which I think is a fair question to ask for a sector that quite honestly, and particularly in the upper ranks, is not as diverse as we would like it to be. And that's a really hard thing to tackle, because at its core, it requires us to interrogate ourselves and our own institutional practices. And I do this in my own institution because, so the foundation has a Black gay president. So diversity has been achieved, is the idea that some might have. And I have to interrogate my own behavior, because it would be easy for me to say, well, wow, we've got lots of diversity here. And yet, it's very easy, if you take your eye off that objective, to find yourself with a very different institution 3 or 4 years down the road. So I think for leadership, for trustees, because I always say everything that is right or wrong with the foundation can be laid at the feet of its CEO and its trustees. And in this instance, the board and the CEO have to be fully committed to the idea of diversity in all its forms, not just racial. And it'll happen if you have that.
Foundations, Darren, are hiring people in new ways and identifying grantees in new ways. But they're also firing people in new ways. Talk about that changing model. The fact that CEOs now are no longer sitting in secure situations with no accountability, with sort of sense of being tenured. Is that era over? And does that mean new people have new opportunities at the top?
Well, I certainly think the idea of the aloof, behind the curtain, not very transparent foundation CEO that era is over, and that's a good thing. There was a time, of course, as I was reminded the other day, as I was running out late and knowing that I was going to be late, when my assistant said, in the old days, the foundation president had a car and driver. Maybe we should go back to that. I said, well, I don't think we'll ever go back to the days when a foundation president has a car and driver. And that is actually a good thing. So all leadership, not just in philanthropy, as Larry Kramer reminded us last night, it's not just in philanthropy. Heads of all sorts of organizations now find themselves scrutinized in ways that a generation ago didn't exist. And so I actually think that's all good. I think it's also a good thing that we don't have life tenure for program officers and foundation staff. I think working in a foundation, particularly in a grant-making or leadership role, can be corrupting, because no matter how hard you try, every day you listen to people who say insincere things, and it would be so easy to believe it. And for some, it is easy for them to believe it. And that's why I don't think foundation presidents should be honored. And that's okay. It's, for me, that's my point of view. I think it's absolutely fine. But I am serving in a role of a great institution. It's the institution that should be honored. I've been to 3 Ballet Hispanico events in my life. It would have been absurd to honor me. And yet they were prepared and, in fact, offered to do that first, because that was what they expected. And so, yeah, I think it's a different time, but I think the behaviors are still there. And to militate against that for all of us, and I know all of my colleagues who are here as part of your program grapple with this issue of how do you remain authentic? How do you know how to cut the wheat from the chaff, and to really see between so much? As I tell my staff all the time, I give huge haircuts to any compliment or salutary words that come my way, because I understand. I do.
We have time for another question back here. Need a microphone?
Hi, Darren. You spoke about collaboration with external parties, the culture of Ford Foundation, and the 2 broad issue areas of climate change and inequality. Can you talk about collaboration within Ford Foundation among the different programs?
I think it's fair to say that the Ford Foundation as an institution has been challenged in the area of internal collaboration. We, by structure, have been too hierarchical. There are far too many silos, and all of the incentives discourage the necessary collaboration for the kind of change that we want to help contribute to. And so my remit includes helping to create a culture where we bust through those silos and where we reimagine ourselves not as a foundation with 3 program divisions and 34 units of work and 10 regional offices, but that we imagine ourselves as an institution that seeks to harmonize and align all of our internal assets and resources, and to not think first about the organogram. And that's really hard to do, because legacy organizations attach a lot of status to budget, to how many people report to you, to how many people you can elbow out of the way to get the biggest share of the pie. And so leadership has to work against the natural incentive structure and the natural behaviors of people. So I want to celebrate the fact that when I became vice president at Ford, I met with the president and I said, this area of the foundation, which is in my area, really, when you conceptualize our work, really doesn't belong in my division. And there was this silence, and the response was, you're probably right, but that's too big a battle for you to take on. And I said, it's not a battle. I'm prepared to give away, millions of dollars and a lot of staff to so that ideally this program can be better rationalized and we gain efficiencies and reduce redundancy and actually make it better for our grantees so they don't have to shop up and down this building for grants. And I was unsuccessful. But what I will say is when I became president, the first change I made was to take our sexuality and reproductive health and rights program, which was in my area of creativity and free expression, and put it where it belongs in the foundation, in the democracy and human rights program. And so what I need to do is continue to do that. And that is a process in an institution like Ford, but one that my trustees are deeply committed to. And with their support, it makes it possible for me to make some of those changes that are necessary and essential for us to be the kind of institution we need to be.
So I just want to note there's time for one more question. We get this microphone there. And just want to note that throughout the Aspen Philanthropy Group conversations, the word collaboration came up more than any other. The need to collaborate within the organization, collaborate among foundations, collaborate across sectors. And the core reason was this sense that the goals are so large. Save democracy, eradicate disease, and climate change. The goals are so large that no one foundation, no matter what the resources, can do it alone. Yes.
I'm very pleased to see that you are sensitive to the fact that an age-old institution like Ford is perhaps changing. That's very healthy, very difficult to do. Which brings me to my question. Do you have any feeling about the new kind of blood that's coming into the foundation world, like the Gates operation and how he's bringing in money in from so many different people, and that's his goal? Do you see a difference between that approach and the old-fashioned approach of Kresge and Ford and Rockefeller, et cetera?
Thank you. That's a great question. So let me say that I am beyond elated by all of this new money in philanthropy. I look forward to the day when the Ford Foundation isn't the second largest philanthropy in America, when it's not even in the top 10.
Look out, here comes Aliko Dangote.
Exactly. When the great new billionaires come into their time of philanthropy, I'm very excited about that time. And I give great credit to Bill and Melinda Gates. I was at Rockefeller when Bill Gates really started the enterprise with his father and his wife, and they spent an enormous amount of time at Rockefeller and at Carnegie and at Ford, learning and asking questions, being inquisitive about what worked and what didn't work. And so I think that shows that they didn't approach their philanthropy in an arrogant way, but one that was very thoughtful. And today, we work with Gates, Midyar, so many of the new philanthropies, and they are bringing enormous energy and new ideas and new resources to the philanthropic space. My one worry, if there is a worry, as I dream about the day when Ford isn't in the top 10. My one worry is that no one in that top 10 will call themselves a social justice foundation. Because if those of us who are privileged today aren't prepared to ask fundamental questions, I am often inspired by Dr. King's words. And he spoke to a group of philanthropists once, and what he said was that philanthropy is commendable, but philanthropy should not absolve the philanthropist of asking the question, why is there so much injustice that philanthropy is needed in your society in the first place? And I hope that all of the great new philanthropy of the future, that there will be philanthropists who do question and interrogate our ideals and our practices and try to reconcile that and not simply want to practice charity and do project work.
Please join me in thanking Darren Walker.